Welcome back to the Adult Volunteer Literacy Tutor Training. We just talked about general comprehension and how important comprehension is last time. Today, we're going to start digging into the different types of comprehension and some tools and practices for each. Today is all about reading and writing comprehension. Reading comprehension is the most common comprehension facet our learners want to work on and improve. We're also going to discuss writing comprehension throughout the presentation, as reading and writing are so closely intertwined. Many of the techniques you will use for reading, you could also use for writing. This means we need to have a lot of different techniques and ideas about reading and writing comprehension to offer our learners and assisting them in achieving their goals of better reading. You will see the biggest disparity here between levels of comprehension and might have to employ both direct and indirect instruction to help your learner. Remember, we want to encourage as much self-agency, or being self-sufficient in owning their own learning, and inquiry as much as possible, keeping to indirect to ensure the learner is becoming more independent. However, there will be times they just don't know, and continuously asking them will only exasperate the problem and discourage them. Reading is a great way to improve your writing. You can see examples of how sentences are structured in reading, examples of where the main idea you're looking for is located. Even listening to audiobooks, if you're more auditory, helps with writing, as you can listen to the inherent beat of the language and understand where certain parts need to be in a sentence. And writing is great practice for reading. You can practice sentence structures. You know what your main idea is and where it makes the most sense to place it. You can even say aloud what you're wanting to write, and with technology, many programs will dictate what you say into writing. So really, all four skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, can be used with each other to help and support the other skills. This is important when working with learners with different learning styles and those with learning disabilities. Specifically with writing, we see learners with learning disabilities struggle, especially those with dyslexia and other types of writing disabilities. They feel like they can't write or are a failure at writing, even reading, because of these. However, their speaking is fine with perfect grammar and understanding. This is a way to start opening the door for these kinds of learners, and even learners with preference for auditory learning. Overall, remember, remain adaptable. Now, let's look at what reading, and therefore writing, comprehension really is, and some techniques. We have looked at one reading comprehension technique already. Remember the KWL? What does the learner know? What does the learner want to know? And what has the learner learned? We did one as practice earlier, but let's do another one now. This time, reading comprehension. You can include some writing as well if you want, but let's focus on reading. So take a minute, pause the video, and write out your KWL chart as seen here for reading comprehension. What do you already know about reading and writing comprehension? What do you want to learn about these types of comprehension? And leave the L, the what you have learned, for later. We'll come back to it. So take a minute now, pause, and hit play when you're ready. So, what do you know? Well, hopefully you have at least KWL as a technique in that first column. And what is it you want to learn? Keep track of that as we go through and see if we answer everything you want to learn. If we don't, hang on to it and feel free to ask in our discussion later. Most likely, you aren't the only one with that question. Now, let's get started. There are a lot of different reading and writing comprehension techniques and approaches. But what is reading comprehension? It's pretty straightforward, but it can be a little complex when you start breaking it down. Reading comprehension relates to all parts of reading and how we read it. This includes the overall text, the main idea, its purpose, etc., all the way down to the vocabulary and individual words and word choice. Directly though, reading comprehension is about understanding the meaning of the text. We saw this with the Marlup, remember? Still don't know what's going on there. Comprehension is understanding meaning and meaning creation. Sometimes we need to learn the words to understand what is going on, all the way to learning to how a paragraph is formed to understand the larger meaning. Writing comprehension is much the same, maybe a little inverse. Producing, this is important, producing what they know from reading, listening, and just their own thoughts. Writing should also have a main idea, purpose, and overall cohesion, along with clear vocabulary and relatable, meaningful words. So, let's start with the smallest part that can impede understanding, vocabulary. Before we get into it though, let's take a moment. Have you ever had a moment where you forgot a word? It's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't remember what it is? Or perhaps you know how to say and spell the word, but you can't remember what it means? Instead of using the original word you planned on using, you choose something similar and keep going. I do that one all the time. This issue happens just as much with our learners as it does us, but they may not have the knowledge or expertise to be able to switch to a different word. This relates to knowledge and understanding word families, a part of reading comprehension. Here, we can see one sublist of just the most frequent words in academia. As you can see, some of these are important to everyday life as well. Concept, compare, contrast, economic, environment. Also, here's a word list of some of the most common word families in the English language. This is just the start of the ones here that start with A. But as you can see, there are plenty of important keywords in there they will need to know. Such as, we see name, bank, fail, bat, back, attack. These are all very key words and more that they will need to know if they want to get by. Sometimes you might need to employ some direct instruction to learn these, but then they will still have to learn the meaning and how to employ them correctly. There are many techniques to do this, and you can find more on the internet. But we have one here that works in. This would be an example of indirect instruction, as it allows the learner to chew and work on with the content and apply it in a way that works for them. Here, it's called vocabulary illustration. You, or the learner, if they're comfortable, can write the word at the top and then define it. Have the learner write their own definition though, not just what they can pull up from a dictionary. Then, draw a picture that illustrates the word or concept, whatever makes sense to them, even if it doesn't make sense to you. Then, write a sentence using the word, clarifying the picture, or goes along with the picture. This way, each part is connected, intensifying the connection and solidifying the meaning to the word through different methods. As you can see, reading comprehension goes down to the smallest part of reading. Same with writing, a single word. But it can also go to the largest part, the whole text. We have multiple strategies for this section, as these can be applied to individual sections in the text, as well as what most learners will want to focus on, the whole text. That doesn't mean you should neglect vocabulary though. Keep an eye out for moments when you can work on vocabulary during reading. It might be a good way to break up the monotony of reading and add some diversity to your lesson. Back to reading though. We have what we know as reading strategies. When you start reading with your learner, you should go over what reading strategy you want to do. Let's look at this handout. You can also see it here on the slide. It's called Introducing Reading Strategies. You should have one in your packet. These are helpful when working with our learners, as the things mentioned are often hindrances to reading comprehension. Remember, meaning only comes from understanding, and understanding can only happen if you get through the whole text, or at least the sections. Working on each of these, though, can be a lesson in itself. But let's go through some of the key ones that might not be as straightforward. Before reading, have the learner read a summary, if it's available, first, and retell it to you in their own words. This lets them create meaning and understanding for themselves and checking with you. Having some understanding of what to expect before they read will encourage their reading and help them understand. This also allows them to tap into their prior experience and knowledge beforehand, preparing them for reading. During reading, encourage them to check constantly for meaning. Don't let them forget why they are reading. Next, if they're reading silently and they come to a word they don't know, tell them to mark it, skip it, and move on. This way, they aren't wasting their time stumbling over a single word, therefore missing the whole meaning. Also, sometimes the meaning for the word will be given later. They can kind of look back and figure it out on their own. If they are reading aloud, though, supply the word quietly and encourage them to move on. Mark it yourself to come back to you later. Letting them stew and flounder on a word might make them feel like they were unable to complete the reading because of not understanding. Coming back to a troubling word after the reading is complete will give them the sense of accomplishment of finishing the reading, as well as a chance to try the word without the pressure of reading. They might even know what the word means at that point, as it was given later in the reading. After reading, make sure they perform a type of appropriate activity to internalize and interact with the reading. This is important for them making meaning and comprehension on their own later without you there. That's the whole point, right? You can tie writing into here by having them read and then write in their own words. Making use of the same text for reading and writing is a way of making a longer lesson and tying the two together, while also keeping the material coherent. And they're familiar with it at that point, so it's more comfortable for them. This was a lot, so take a small break and stretch before we get back into looking at some specific reading comprehension techniques. Make sure you have a pencil to take notes and hit play when you're ready. Welcome back. Something to keep in mind before we get started on some more specific techniques is that these techniques can be adapted to each of the 4 skills: writing, reading, speaking, and listening. Many of these are employed in teaching within each of these 4 skills and are great to use in tutoring as well. They'll be familiar with it. We know you and your learners likely have an understanding of the part needed and expected in writing and reading. Main idea, purpose. But much of the breakdown we see in learners comes in with organizing their ideas, thoroughly explaining them, and ensuring they are coherent and sequenced. Sometimes our learners get caught up in thinking of how it needs to sound, technical grammar, and too afraid to just get their thoughts out. So we need to give our learners tools on how to write and read on their own. So let's do some reverse generating by doing some reading and examining how a passage is written before we get into some techniques. I'm going to read a passage aloud over acid rain. Go ahead and read along. All right, are you ready? When water falls to earth, it seeps into the ground. When that water is high in acid, it prevents trees and other plants from absorbing nutrients or needed materials through their roots. After many years, trees lose their leaves, become less able to resist disease, and may eventually die. Acid rain also enters rivers, lakes, streams, and oceans. If the acid level of the water gets too high, small food fish cannot survive. Insects and water plants die. As their food supplies disappear, birds, mammals, and large fish starve. Before we look at a tool, I want to get your opinion. Do you think this is a good paragraph? Why or why not? Go ahead, pause the video, and write down your thoughts before hitting play. So, what did you think? For our purposes, this is a good paragraph. It has a main idea, it's clearly sequenced, and provides clear details. It starts with talking about rain, narrowing it to acid rain, and then talking about general effect of acid rain, furthering their argument to specific examples of acid rain effects from trees to animals and plants, narrowing it more and more specifically as it continues. This is a good example of a paragraph. But how does this help our learners who struggle with writing or even reading? It's not fair to just ask them to copy this and hope for the best. But we can use this paragraph and teach them a tool they can use on their own in the future, where they won't always have a good example to start from. The first technique we're going to look at is something that's probably familiar to everyone: brainstorming. We're going to practice some brainstorming with that paragraph above. Brainstorming is a great comprehension technique with adults as it activates their background knowledge and lets you evaluate their prior knowledge. It also stimulates interest in the topic as it creates a connection between their prior knowledge and experience to what they're reading now. You can see the procedure for brainstorming here. You, as the tutor, can write everything down if the learner is low level or if the learner is able to write it down as a kind of free write. Then you can collaborate in categorizing. Ask where they think it should go and why. Have them name and create the category so it makes sense to them. Not you, them. Brainstorming is a quick and simple technique that you can do with a single word, a phrase, or a whole excerpt. However, brainstorming might not be the best technique if the learner has limited to no background knowledge. If you pick a reading that is related to their interest, though, this should always work as something quick and easy to do. Let's do this. Take a few minutes, pause the video, and try clustering the paragraph on acid rain yourself. You can see an example of a cluster map in your packet or make your own. There's also one here. Take a few minutes, pause the video, and give it a try. Hit play when you're ready. So, did you make one? Did you struggle? Did you succeed? If you struggled, why? Take a few more minutes, pause the video, and reflect. Write it down, then hit play. If you struggled and you felt it was because you didn't understand or have an example, that's the same feeling our learners are experiencing. They didn't have the foundational knowledge required to complete the task or perform any meaningful comprehension. So, let's lay a foundation and do an example. The main idea is acid rain, so it goes in the center bubble here. What is a sub-idea? I chose trees. Trees would be one, listing the effects including the leaves. Rivers and oceans would be another, listing those as well. Animals leads to insects and water plants and those effects, rounding it up with another list. So by the end, we have something that might look like this. For those that understood the task and made one, does yours look like this? If not, that's okay, and a very good example of different understanding and personalizing the approach. This is one that makes sense to me, sort of. I don't understand acid rain very well. And you may have one that makes sense to you, however, but your learner's version might be different from yours. That doesn't make it incorrect, just personalized for their own comprehension, which is what's important. Clustering is a great tool that can be used anywhere and is easy to do quickly. It also lets them organize their thoughts and brainstorm some answers where the initial instinct is to just write, and it might leave them floundering, lacking ideas, and just overwhelmed. The next comprehension technique is called paraphrasing. This should sound familiar. This is great to encourage learners to recall main ideas and specific important facts from the material. Here, you want to have the learner read paragraphs slowly. You can have them read aloud as well to help them along. Have the learner locate the main idea in around 2 details. Encourage looking back at the text, but make sure to have them record the main idea and the details in their own words. No copying directly from the text. You can have them write it down or even record it on a phone or a computer. Using a voice recording rather than writing for this is very appropriate for learners with learning disabilities or those who prefer an auditory learning style. This way, they aren't working to read their own notes and practice with comprehension of the text. You can also do this with a summary of the text. not just paraphrasing an excerpt. So you can use paraphrasing and summarizing. The method is the same. The next technique is called think aloud. This tackles a skill that many readers and learners don't consider to think about, making predictions about what they will read, visualizing linking information with prior knowledge, and monitoring their own comprehension. This is something we always do when we start to read, but don't think about doing. Our learners probably haven't internalized the skill, so we might have to show them how it's done. This is also a great activity for haptic and visual learners, as visual learners will see the skill in motion, and the haptic learners will be able to do it explicitly themselves. Remember, it's feeling it, even if it's just talking or writing. Here's how we do this one. It takes a little practice to do, but it's worth it for our learners. The tutor will read a passage aloud, while the student follows along silently. You will verbalize all the internal thoughts you had while reading, such as making predictions, describing visual images, sharing an analogy, or applying prior knowledge, verbalizing a confusing point, etc. Anything. After several modeling sessions, the students and learners can practice with you. One way to sequence this would be to have the tutor read the passage and have the learner verbalize their thoughts on the text as you go along. Then the learner can practice with themselves and record the reading session with a checklist of procedures. Slowly, they will start to integrate the strategy into their own reading. It will become more internalized, like it is for us. Actually, think alouds were originally used to study cognitive processes that readers use to construct meaning. Now, it allows us to see how a learner is comprehending the text and start to internalize that procedure. I want to do an example of this, but that's going to be in a separate video because it does take a while. Make sure to check out that video and before you complete your own think aloud. In a way, we're going to do a think aloud ourselves. So go ahead, pause the video, and open up the video called Think Aloud on the Edge in another tab and listen to me read the story and perform a think aloud myself. Then return to this video. After that, I want you to give it a try. Read a story in your packet called A Quirk of Nature in the Think Aloud style. It's in your packet. It should be around the same section we're at now. Record yourself as you do the activity. Make sure to send a copy of the audio file to your literacy counselor. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say about that story. Also, listen to yourself when you're finished. How weird was it? Did you think it was easy? Did you miss something? Reflect and write it down. So go ahead, pause the video and complete both of those tasks, reading the story aloud and performing the think about and recording the experience. And then secondly, recording the reflection. You can write down the reflection or you can just say it all in the one recording. When you're ready, hit play once you're finished. The last technique we're going to look at is called story mapping. It's right here. Story mapping helps new readers focus on important ideas in a text rather than being distracted by other threads or even words. This also helps to provide a visual guide to understand and review. It contains a predictable set of components and shows learners that most stories will follow this particular pattern, helping reinforce making predictions for reading. This also helps learners determine the main idea and important ideas to focus on when reading and visually illustrate the components and the relationships to each other. To do this activity, you need to introduce the learner to components of the story map, as seen here. This is a blank form for the activity, and make sure to go over what each part is. You will want to model how to use the story map by reading the story aloud, providing at points that contain the components of the story map while the learner writes down that information in their own words. Then, you have the learner reread the story and check their map. As a step to make this more difficult, you could have the learner read a new story and complete their map with only your guidance. As the final step, have the learner complete the activity on their own and answer the comprehension questions of what was the main character trying to accomplish and where did the story take place. This strategy is great to adapt to visual, auditory, and haptic learners as it touches on each facet of learning. You can even find pictures to go along with the story. I want you to practice this strategy as well. You should have a blank story map in your packet of materials and the story called The Bag Lady. Complete a story map for the story and reflect. Was it easy? Could you tutor someone to use this? Is this something you think would help? Why or why not? This is going to be your homework. That's a lot on reading and writing comprehension. So let's take a review. Reading comprehension is the type of comprehension you will be dealing with and working with the most with our learners. Reading and writing comprehension relates to vocabulary, structure, content, context, and understanding the overall text. There are a lot of areas your learner could get caught up on, so pinpointing where they're struggling is a great early step in your tutoring relationship. We discussed the reading strategies and how important those are to our learners. Defining reading strategies explicitly that they can start doing implicitly is important to them becoming independent. Then we looked at a bunch of different techniques. The KWL we mentioned in earlier videos, brainstorming, paraphrasing and summarizing, think aloud, and story mapping. There are a lot of tools and guides to help with reading and writing comprehension. There are some more examples and activities in your packet of materials as well. After the video, make sure to take some time and go over all of them and reflect. Do you think these would work? Do you think these would work for you? Why or why not? Is there something confusing about them? Make sure to write it down, as it's something we can definitely discuss. It's also great to see what works for us, also what might work for our learners. Don't forget to do the story mapping activity either. That's your homework. These aren't the only techniques, but these are a good start, and you can find more online or ask your literacy counselor. Something to remember is that many of these can be adapted for all types of comprehension: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Now, if you have any questions, please let your literacy counselor know. Don't forget your story mapping homework and to send in the Think Aloud file. See you all next time.